Our speaker tonight is the director of Apples and Oranges. Yoav Brill is an animator, filmmaker, and musician. He grew up on Be'eri, a kibbutz near the Gaza border, and his uncle, who lives on that kibbutz, married a British volunteer who is now a full-fledged kibbutz member. I'm suspecting that that had something to do with how he came to make this film, but we'll hear more about that in a moment. Yoav's animated film, Ishihara, won first prize in the Haifa Film Festival. Hora, a short animated documentary, won first prize in the Tel Aviv Animation Festival, and I'd be interested to hear also what else he's got in the works. And with that, I would like to welcome Yoav and invite you to take yourself off of mute and take it away. Hey, there you go.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Very well.
Great. So first, thanks for having me. And yeah, as you said, I was actually studying animation, so that's my profession here in Israel. I usually work as an animator and designer for documentaries, for other people's documentaries. And I've made some short films which had the documentary angle to them. I was interviewing people about real subjects and then animating their answers and animating the topics. And so when I felt it's time to do my first feature film, I chose documentary. And I thought at the time that it will probably be a much faster process than making animation, because in animation you're working month, and eventually you'll have like a 10-minute piece. And I thought documentary will be just turning on the camera and I'll have a film in a year or so. And of course it took 5 years.
Wow.
Because as my first subject, I decided to explore the history of kibbutz volunteering, which lasted for around 40 years. And at the beginning, as you said, I have an aunt who's a volunteer from England, so I have half British cousins living in my kibbutz. And I was quite intrigued by this phenomenon of people who came to my kibbutz and stayed there. A lot of them came without the Zionist motivation that you would find with other people who end up living in Israel. They were not necessarily Jewish. So my film, the idea for the film started with talking about people who got married to kibbutzniks and stayed in Israel. And as I started working on the project, I realized that there was no documentary telling the story of kibbutz volunteering from beginning to end. And there were tens of thousands of people who visited Israel, and many of them ended up staying, but the documentaries you would normally see are about the kibbutz and about Zionism, and this story never found its way to the screen. And as I started to investigate and going to the kibbutz archives, I realized there's so much more to the story, and there's so much more angles that I haven't even thought of. And then, I decided I'm going to be the one to try at least to tell this big story in very short 80 minutes film.
Did you get funding from the kibbutz movement? I mean, who was interested in funding this?
Well, in Israel, you would normally go to one of 3 TV stations who would invest money in documentaries, and one of them was a Yes Doco. It's like satellite cable station who picked up the project, and then we got some money from an Israeli film fund. And if there was no involvement from the kibbutz movement, I don't think they would have any money to invest in such a project. And to tell you the truth, I didn't want necessarily them to be involved in it, because the kibbutz movement and the volunteers office, which still exist in Israel, they have their own agenda, and they have their own motivation to bring volunteers to Israel. And only the other day I saw like a TV piece, a short TV piece on the news about how the volunteers are now coming back to Israel, and they went and interviewed some new volunteers, and they show a piece of my film. And it's usually something that probably is pushed by the kibbutz volunteers office. But I wanted to tell the story with the good side and then maybe the more difficult and problematic subjects that they wouldn't necessarily like to hear. So I did invite the people in the kibbutz volunteer movement, kibbutz volunteers office to the premiere of the film, but they had no involvement in the actual film.
Have you had complaints of what things that you included?
Not really. I mean, the story in my film ends around 20 years ago. I mean, I kind of draw the line of kibbutz volunteering as a big movement in 2001, when there was the second intifada in Israel, and the numbers dropped to maybe 100 volunteers a year. So this phenomenon still exists, but for me, I thought I'm talking about something that is in the past, and whatever happens today, it's kind of a new thing. The kibbutz is no longer the kibbutz we know. So I didn't have any complaints about it. No.
What does it mean? Many of the kibbutzim are privatized. I don't know. The areas, I don't know. Is it?
Be'eri is one of the last kibbutzim not to be completely privatized. In fact, only last year we started, and when I say we started, I mean my parents and my brother, when we visit my parents in the kibbutz, because I live in Tel Aviv. But only a year ago we started paying for the food that is being served in the dining room, which is something that other kibbutzim moved to maybe 20 years ago, and some of them even closed their dining rooms or made them like commercial dining rooms where people can, come like big restaurants. And in my kibbutz, the process is a lot slower, and it's usually due to the kibbutz being financially successful, that it can kind of, keep the ideology without the necessity to privatize.
So what is it? Well, many of the kibbutzim though are no longer communal. So what does it mean to be a volunteer on a kibbutz these days?
I'm pretty sure it's different, but the majority of today's volunteers, they work in kibbutzim who might still rely on agriculture, and they need their working hands. So it's probably different for them socially, but I think the experience of volunteering was probably a lot to do with just being with other volunteers and staying with other volunteers. So in that regard, if it's a big kibbutz and there are other volunteers around you, so it might be quite similar, but the kibbutz is very different.
Right. Okay, I think maybe we'll open it up to wider questions. Maybe we'll run the first poll just to kick things off. So we're going to ask you folks just to get a sense of the audience here, and then we'll let Yoav maybe react to that. So if you could respond, I've been on a kibbutz. Never, at least once, for a week or more, a month or more, 6 months or more. Let's see what the distribution is. The responses are coming in. I got 71% participated, 80%. Give it 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to share the results. So are you able to see that, Yoav?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. So a mix, but very, few people from, okay, about half have been at least once, and then the distribution of just, for longer periods. I would add to myself, I was on a kibbutz for several years. Okay.
Cool.
Okay. So with that, I invite you to either type your questions in the chat or raise your hand or just take yourself off mute and speak up. And we'd like to. I did want to know what happened. I mentioned, during our rehearsal, I was curious what happened to the boy who got LSD, the 8-year-old boy who was given LSD.
I was actually, I managed to find him, and I wrote him an email and, said, it would be really nice to talk to you to my documentary. I don't think he was really happy about it, or at least he stopped answering my second email. I didn't get no response to. So I thought, I'm not the kind of director who would, force people to participate in my film. But he's all right. He's okay.
He's not still having flashbacks.
Maybe, but but he became a grown-up, so a functioning grown-up. So that's probably good.
This is the first time I heard about charging for meals at the kibbutz, and maybe you can talk about some of the other ways that the kibbutzim have privatized, because this is different from 1968 when I was there.
Well, I think mostly for kibbutzim who had financial problems, which is, the majority of them, it was a way of kind of getting themselves, keeping themselves together or organizing their financial meanings. And that means to start calculating, how much money theoretically everybody earns from what they are doing. And eventually people are now, earning their salaries in the kibbutz, depending on what they do. So that was a big thing for a lot of people. It was in, the first time of their lives they had to find a job or at least do something that was profitable, which is something that before wasn't a thing at all. And I guess, it started long before, when at the time the children were sleeping in the kindergartens and not at their parents' houses. And that already changed in the beginning of the 80s, when the children of the kibbutz started, sleeping at their parents' homes. So it was like a long process. And today people own their houses in the kibbutz. I mean, if you had a house in the kibbutz before, it was kind of a house that was given to you, and now you owe your house, so you can rent it if you like to. So it's a whole bunch of things that are no longer communal.
So I noticed that the documentary focused on Europeans and especially Scandinavians and non-Jews. And that was very different from my experience in 1970 when it was overwhelmingly Americans and overwhelmingly Jews. So I was interested if that was a conscious choice or that was just the people you were able to track down and interview.
Well, it was a very conscious choice because I felt that the people who were non-Jews were the most interesting for me in the perspective of the Israeli story, because we already saw a lot of films in Israel about all kinds of subjects dealing with Zionism and the whole big Israeli story. And I thought that the non-Jewish volunteers were an anomaly in the Israeli culture, because Israel is not usually the country to welcome people who are not Jewish to Israel and say, yeah, you can come and stay with us. And the majority of volunteers in general were not Jewish. And the Jewish volunteers, usually they came with much more organized groups, and they had like the cooperation of Israel and the Israelis embassies, and Israel kind of wanted them to come because they might stay in the kibbutz, they might make aliyah. And you can see till this day the kids who come with the glit, for instance, they are kind of the continuation of the Jewish volunteers who came to Israel in an organized way. But I thought the not Jewish volunteers, they were the ones who, when they got married to kibbutzniks, it raised a problem. And I started the film with the Scandinavians. And actually, when Israel is talking about volunteers, they're usually talking about the Swedes and the Shvediot. It's kind of the symbol of volunteering in Israel, because they were so different than, the average kibbutznik. So I thought I should focus on this group.
Let's launch the second poll right now, and then we'll continue this topic. Okay, so since 1967, England has sent the most volunteers to Israel with about 50,000. Which country is second as the source of volunteers with 40,000? I think you've skewed the results. So I'm getting, well, at least got one result for Sweden. One vote for Sweden. Let's see what else. Take a guess. There are no penalties for wrong answers. Okay, we have 77% participated. Give it 10 more seconds. Okay. Okay, you want to reveal the correct answer, Yoav?
Well, as far as I know, it's the South Africans. But I would say that it's not based on my own research, because getting the numbers right was really difficult. And when people ask me all sorts of questions about volunteering and about the statistics of volunteers, I don't see myself as a real expert, because the kibbutz organization was always a bit messy, and there was no real research about volunteering that I could find. So I don't think anybody gathered the numbers. I couldn't find any. So I can tell you that the years when the highest number of volunteers came was like 78, 79. I guess the South Africans, like the Americans, they did come with the youth organization. So that's maybe the reason why there were a lot more of them. But yeah, there were many Swedes as well, at least comparing to the size of the population in Sweden and Denmark. The Scandinavian really ruled this culture of kibbutz volunteering.
I have a question.
Yes,
Yep.
go ahead.
I was there as a volunteer in '67, Israel, that is. And I spent a month on a kibbutz. And I thought this was the ideal way for people to live. It would fix all the problems in the world. I can't stand the selfishness and greed that rule this country.
Mm-hmm.
And it creates terrible starvation in other parts of the world where people who live here just throw their stuff away. Doesn't matter. Who cares? Nobody cares about anybody else. But on a kibbutz, it was just beautiful. That's in my experience. So I thought this was the ideal. Everybody should want to live this way. I'm so disappointed in what's happened in Israel. We should have promoted more, not turned it into no justice again. Doesn't matter.
And did you want to live in a kibbutz?
I would have if there had been some here. I probably would have, yes.
But I think the idea of commune living is of course, in Israel you had the kibbutz, which was a unique experiment, but it wasn't like it wasn't the only place which you had communes, and most of them wouldn't last for a long time. So I don't know if the failure of the kibbutz is an Israeli thing or it's just more of a human subject.
Yeah, I mean, just sharing my own experience with kibbutz, that it seemed very idyllic to me as well. I was on kibbutz Rosh Hanikra until I saw a general meeting where they were voting whether or not to what subject somebody would study in the university. And the idea of a room full of people deciding what I would study, made it seem a little less idyllic.
I think it would seem idyllic to volunteers who stayed for maybe a few weeks or a few months in the kibbutz, and they weren't necessarily exposed to everything that it took to run a kibbutz and everything that was problematic about it. So I do find a lot of volunteers in the kibbutz Facebook groups were talking about how it was the best time of their lives, and of course it was. But talking to volunteers who stayed for longer time, for a longer time in the kibbutz, maybe for years, then you kind of realize that it's not, it's trying to be the ideal thing, but a lot of times it just clashes with the reality and the financial reality of having a commune, a big commune, and human nature in general, whether you want to live your life and decide for yourself what you want to do, or whether you want to share everything and be dependent on the other people's decision. So yeah, there's probably a reason why idyllic communes, most of them didn't last forever.
I'm seeing a little bit, still people trying to wrestle with the idea of what it means for a kibbutz to privatize. There was a question, are the private operators of the kibbutzim Jewish? It's not exactly that they were sold, that the kibbutzim were sold to an operator. Maybe you could explain a little bit about how a kibbutz kind of became not communal.
Well, I'm not a big expert for that subject, but if at the time, if you were a kibbutz member, you were kind of a shareholder for everything that was in the kibbutz, privatizing the kibbutz meant that, every person was for its own. And generally speaking, it's like the kibbutz had turned into a village. It doesn't mean that there's no communal lives and there's no holiday. Then it's not a really, really good place to still raise your children in, but people today can come from the outside and build their own house within the boundaries of the kibbutz, but not necessarily be a kibbutz member. So it's more of an open society. People still vote for every person who would come and join the kibbutz, but it's a lot more like a village. That would be the easiest answer.
I think it might be analogous in the United States to a co-op, which is a building where people own shares, or they own their own private space, but they still have to vote and approve on things that affect everybody.
Yeah, and they do have, their life is their own business, and they're making money for themselves. They don't rely on it. It's not like you can work with, in whatever you want to do, and then people are, sharing their salary, and the money is being shared by everyone equally. It's not the situation anymore.
No. We had another question where your film seemed to raise the question of the role of non-Jews in a Jewish state. Were there objections from group outside the kibbutz movement to the practice of bringing in so many non-Jewish volunteers?
I think the thing with non-Jewish people living in the kibbutz was mostly a kibbutz dilemma. The kibbutz had to face seeing how the community maybe changed a bit, but of course we don't talk about large numbers of non-Jewish volunteers who stayed in the kibbutz, but it was a first time for every kibbutz to decide how to deal with people who came from the outside, and maybe took the kibbutz kids with them, back to Sweden or Denmark. So it was mostly a kibbutz thing. When it was at the time, it was a lot more difficult to go through the process of giyur. What's
conversion?
Yeah, of conversion. And as I show in the film, it kind of started back then with the Israeli system for conversion. It started with the kibbutz volunteers. So I guess the religious establishment had more of a problem with non-Jewish volunteers who stayed in the kibbutz, because they had no way of practicing a religious Jewish life, but the kibbutz, on the other hand, wasn't a religious place. So, it just wanted things to be easy, but it didn't want the Jewish establishment, the religious establishment, to force the kibbutz to, build a synagogue or something, just for the right of the volunteers to convert. So there was a kind of culture clash between the secular kibbutz and the Jewish establishment, the religious establishment.
Has your film been shown? Where has your film been shown in Israel? Was it on television or what?
Yes, it's this documentary, it's available in Israel, in this documentary TV station. And it played in festivals both in Israel and around the world, and in the Berlin Jewish Film Festival recently. And I do screen it in kibbutzim and in local cinematheques. And we only this week we had a really big screening in next to the Kinneret in a big theater. So we're still running. Yeah.
It's been seen in Sweden?
Not yet. It was sold to both a Dutch TV station and a Finnish TV station. So it did play in Scandinavia. I think it's yet to be screened in Sweden, as far as I remember. Maybe I'm wrong.
Okay. Okay.
No.
Any other questions?
Did the kibbutz volunteers had an impact of Israeli culture? I saw this question in the chat.
Okay.
So,
Well, let's let him respond to that question, then Gittel will get to you. Okay,
Okay.
go ahead.
I guess they did. I mean, I guess they had I guess they did affect the kibbutz life, which in return affected the Israeli society, because, you know, when we're talking about 67 and even the years after, Israel had yet to even have a TV channel, like a public TV broadcaster. Up until the early 90s, we didn't have any other TV station apart from the Israeli public broadcaster. So Israel was quite close to things that did happen in the world when it came to culture and music, and the volunteers just came and brought the Western culture. And of course, when we talk about 67, it meant like it was really the high times for the youth movement and the anti-establishment culture. And it just landed in the middle of the kibbutz. And when you talk with kibbutzniks who were young people at the time, they really always talk about the way they were being exposed to this culture, because they didn't, the kibbutz, the kibbutz youth didn't even know the city's life, and suddenly they were being exposed to something a lot bigger than what they knew. So yeah, of course they had an impact.
Gittel?
Yeah, so your film beautifully depicted the fact that so many volunteers came because the kibbutz was such a different life. There were books, I remember books being written about the kibbutz life, and they were not just meant for Jews, they were meant for non-Jews when I was a teenager. You heard about this, and so many of the volunteers, as you've said, if not the preponderance, were not Jewish. So today, there are fewer volunteers, but you said there still are volunteers. Who are the volunteers today? What are they coming for, since the kibbutz is not the kibbutz of yesteryear? And are they Jewish? Who is really coming?
I think the biggest change was that you started seeing volunteers who came from places which maybe found out about Israeli kind of late, and they joined the party, later than others. And it's mostly South Koreans. Yeah, and kids from India, which you never saw at the time. So you still have volunteers from the same places, like Germany, Denmark, but there are fewer. But seeing Koreans in kibbutzim is not a rare thing a rare thing today, and at the time you would never see people from those territories in the world.
That's actually not surprising. I'll just say that our daughter spent some time in South Korea, like 2 years, and we visited there, and South Korean bookshops have a section on the wisdom of the Jews and what
Yeah.
South Koreans can learn from the Jews. Jews are, the stereotypes are all positive stereotypes, but super positive, that somehow the Jews are all brilliant and resourceful.
Of course, it's true. Yeah, we do hear about it, and there's also the religious, attraction of South Koreans who sometimes come to Israel as in youth groups, more for really religious youth groups, to see the local Christian sightseeing and stuff.
Right. Okay, any last questions before we let Yoav go back to sleep? It's 3 in the morning.
I don't
It's 3 in the morning.
question. So I had been on a program, Kibbutz Ulpan, and it looked like sort of Jewish agency was using that as a way to promote Aliyah and give a positive experience, mostly for Jewish people coming to Israel. Is that still going on? And do you know if that had an effect?
I think that the ulpans were really a big thing, which I didn't have the time to touch upon in the film. It was a big thing for the Jewish volunteers, and there may be a few of them still exist in Israel as like ulpans in the kibbutz. But of course, when we had the big Aliyah movement from the former Soviet countries, the former USSR in the early 90s, there were a lot of Jewish immigrants from Russia, and they were the ones to occupy the ulpans that once had kibbutz Jewish volunteers. So what was the second part of the question? Sorry.
Whether it had their desired effect of promoting Aliyah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that today Taglit would be the equivalence of what at the time were like youth groups who came to the ulpans. So it still exists in many forms, but it doesn't necessarily have something to do with the kibbutz. It might be just people who study in Israeli schools in the foreign departments, which in Jerusalem, at least next to Bezalel, where I studied animation, there was a school for foreign kids, and I saw a lot of Jewish kids who studied there. So that might be the way it manifests today.
I know the statistics are probably not reliable, but do you have a gut sense of between the volunteers who stayed and the ones who married Israelis and took them back home with them? Did the kibbutz movement net gain or net loss from the whole enterprise?
It's a good question. I would say there were more kibbutznik and volunteers who stayed in the kibbutz, at least, but that's from my experience when I think about people from my kibbutz who today live abroad. I think the majority of them stayed in the kibbutz, which doesn't necessarily mean they stayed married. Okay?
Yeah.
And that was one of the things about this international relationships, is that sometimes they did force the question of whether you're staying in Israel or moving to another place, which wasn't easy for any of the sides. I would tell you that in the majority of times it was the husband who would decide where to stay. I mean, you would see more kibbutznik women who moved to the countries of their volunteer husband, and you would see more kibbutznik, like men who stayed with their kibbutznik, with their volunteers' wives in the kibbutz. So that's the statistic I can provide.
We have a last question from Bill Levine. Go ahead, Bill.
I want. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
How were you able to get all the, track down the films? I mean, was it a Sherlock Hemlock effort to get all those film clips, going back all those years?
Mm-hmm. Well, it came from three main sources, and the first was just traveling to kibbutz archives and see what they got. Yeah, and they did, the kibbutznik, they usually did have one person with an 8mm camera who were filming everything, which doesn't always, it doesn't necessarily mean that they had documented the volunteers, but I did manage to find some interesting stuff. And we did go to the more official archives. If you had like TV pieces about volunteers, which ran in the Israeli public broadcaster at the time, so we did find some interesting things there. A lot of things came from YouTube, and I saw like just people who visited the kibbutz at the time, and they uploaded their old films to YouTube, and I did manage to talk with some of them, and they brought me their films, and also some TV stations around the world. Like we got some really quality stuff from the Norwegian public TV station, which they went at the time to Israel and filmed a piece about the Norwegian volunteers. So we had like 30 minutes of 16mm color footage, which was wonderful.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Thank you. Well done, Yoav, and we thank you for your 5 years of hard effort to weave that all together into a wonderful film.
Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. Zoom applause.
Thank you. Thank you. We loved the film.
We loved the film.
We
Mhm.
Loved it. It was great.
Thank you so much.